Good evening, all. Naval War College community, family, friends, and guests, welcome. I am Captain Peter Halverson, the Chief of Staff here at the Naval War College, and I would like to welcome you to this evening's event. At this time, please welcome to the podium the 59th President of the United States Naval War College, Rear Admiral Darrell Walker.
Students, you know you don't have to applaud for me, please. Hey, good evening, and honestly, it's truly an honor to stand here before you this evening as we get ready to enjoy a holiday break. And I remember, 22 plus years ago, I was a student here and coming to the evening lecture, so it was really a treat. So hopefully we have some spouses, friends, and other ones that are here with you. A good evening again. Ambassador Balak, CNO Distinguished Fellow Admiral Verma, Retired General Sider from the Naval War College Foundation, Brigadier General Hammond from the Rhode Island Air National Guard, Provost, CAUS, CMC, Deans, Senior Service Advisor faculty, and most importantly, the students that are here this evening. Like I said, what a truly fine way to end this beautiful day with an evening lecture as we start the holiday break with the Hattendorf lecture. And again, thanks for being here. Dr. Hattendorf, sir, thank you. And how many people have gone on his historical tour of Newport? I am one. Good. You want to go on that with him and Evan. It is truly something that is good for you and your family to learn a little history about that. Today, it is truly my privilege to present the Hattendorf Prize for Distinguished Original Research in Maritime History to Professor Andrew Lambert. Let me begin by telling you about this outstanding award. Dr. John Hattendorf is a man known to everyone here, and he is among the most revered American naval historians of our time. And he is legendary at the Naval War College. And in 2011, the Hattendorf Prize was presented for the first time. It recognizes individuals who publish original research, contributes to deeper understanding of naval services and history. The Naval War College Foundation, led by George, where are you at, George, if you are here? George Lang, truly great partners to the Naval War College, generously endowed this prize with a $10,000 gift. Today marks only the 6th time that the Hattendorf Prize has ever been awarded. This award indicates a lifetime of academic achievement. Professor Andrew Lambert, like this award's namesake, is counted among the very best in naval historians. Professor Lambert is a man who's done so many things around the world. It would be impossible to describe them all to you this evening. He is currently the director of the Laughton Naval Unit in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. His focus is in the naval and strategic history of the British Empire, particularly between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. He has lectured in countries around the globe. As you will hear in this award citation in just a few moments, his accomplishments are truly inspiring. The Naval War College is grateful for Professor Lambert. He has participated here extensively for many years. And when we talk about our mission to educate and develop leaders and to strengthen global maritime partnerships, Professor Lambert sets an example that we all should strive to be. Professor Lambert, it is our privilege to honor you here this evening with this award. Congratulations. We look forward to your continued endeavors as a historian and to you here to hear your lecture tonight. So before we bring up Professor Lambert, I would like to ask Brigadier General Sider to come up from the Naval War College Foundation to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Admiral.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And a few words it will be. I just want to thank, not only honor our awardee and honor the idea from our good friend John Hattendorf, but putting these things together requires some work. And it's on that I want to thank the War College for going through the process of identifying these people. My wife and I, this is our second award that we have been involved with. And we've committed to 3 more of them. And, you know, the old axiom, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. So we're very, very proud to do this. And of course, the foundation, for which I've been involved for many years, even as an Army guy, they have been very, very supportive of this as well. So I just want to acknowledge that. And also, I am so happy there's so many people here in the audience to hear about this. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
You stay here, sir. Please stay up here.
Thank you, Admiral Walker, General Sider. If I could please invite Professor Lambert, Professor Hattendorf, please join us on stage. All right, military members in the audience, please, attention to award. The President, United States Naval War College, takes great pleasure in awarding the Hattendorf Prize for Distinguished Original Research in Maritime History to Professor Andrew D. Lambert, King's College, London. Through publications and public outreach, you have demonstrated the importance and impact of your original research in the fields of naval and maritime history. Your illustrious career as a naval historian has connected the civilian and naval worlds. For more than 20 years, you have conducted original research in naval history and maritime strategy to advance the role of naval history in informing other disciplines and debates. You have sparked an intense debate about the origins of maritime power with sea power states, maritime culture, continental empires, and the conflict that made the modern world. Ranging from the classical period to the 21st century, your account asks questions that practitioners today need to consider about the foundation of maritime culture. More than any other historian, you have expanded our understandings of British naval history in the long 19th century, at the height of the Royal Navy's power. You have connected naval power to its intellectual and cultural foundations, and you have communicated that information to both a professional and a public audience. We honor you today as a highly successful naval historian with an intimate and authoritative knowledge of navies and maritime power, both in the past and in the present. Presented this 19th day of December, 2024, at the United States Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, United States of America. Signed, Darrell L. Walker, Rear Admiral, United States Navy. And Professor Lambert, the floor is yours, sir.
We're done. You're not.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Admiral, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests and friends, and there are many in this room I consider to be great friends, and some are very long-standing, above all, the man for whom this award is so wisely named. I'd like to thank everybody involved in organizing this event, organizing the process of having this celebration of historians and the work they do for navies and nations, and the hospitality that this college has offered me, not just this week, but on previous occasions when I've been able to come here and join in the deliberations and to feel the atmosphere of a place that is preparing people for leadership in the future, in an uncertain future. And it's a great honor to be able to offer some thoughts on where we're going and where we might need to gain some inspiration from the past. The past lives. It is not dead matter. It lives because we read it, we think about it, we use it, and we develop our ideas from it. And what I want to do this evening is to look a little sideways from the American past and even the American present and to look at an adjacent past, the British past, and its relationships with a very different power, Imperial Russia, Soviet Russia, often even modern Russia. How does a small democratic maritime power engage with a continental military hegemon? How do we use the advantages of liberal democracy as well as the law and the enforcement of international agreements to advance our strategy, to advance our policy and our options? So when I'm talking about Britain and Russia, remember that there are other big beasts in the room whose relationship is more pressing just at the moment. The Russians haven't gone away, but they are probably not first in your attention. They still are first in our attention on the other side of the Atlantic. They are that much closer. They do come into our airspace fairly frequently and into our underwater space too. So this is an ongoing story, and we have to hope that the West can survive those challenges, profit from the lessons of the past, and move on to a better and more agreeable future. Engaging Russia, asymmetry, using maritime against continental, avoiding the kinds of risks that you face if you get involved in a large land war in a place that you can't control. Anglo-Russian conflicts begin as soon as Russia breaks out of the center of Eurasia and reaches the coast. And that conflict is economic, it's political, it's ideological. When Peter the Great builds his great city of St. Petersburg and calls it his window on the West, he's not satisfied with its security operation, so he builds a huge fortress right outside it. It's called Kronstadt. It's the biggest naval fortress of the 18th century. He is so frightened that the British will throw something through his window on the West, like democracy, that he is prepared to spend a lot of money on a fortress. But his ambitions don't stop right outside. He wants to go all the way to Copenhagen and close down access to the Baltic. He wants to rule the whole of that region. And the British can't allow that to happen because they depend on naval stores from the Baltic to build and maintain their navy, which is their only significant strategic force. So from the time of Peter the Great onwards, the British have been looking at Russia and the Baltic, and increasingly the Black Sea too, as a way of restraining Russia, but also preserving Britain's vital interests. Without those naval stores, there is no Royal Navy, there is no Battle of Trafalgar, there is no victory over Napoleon. So we have to think about these things in a fresh light. The Russians were never going to land in England, and the English were certainly not going to send an army marching on Moscow, because that is a very silly thing to do. The only people who ever made that work were called the Mongols, and they created modern Russia. And they left it a legacy of violent autocracy, which we see to this very day. But of course, the Mongols also created modern China. So we can add that to the list of their great achievements. At the moment, we're looking at a war. It's not called a war, it's called something else, a special military operation, which was launched by the Russian leader. But it fits into a pattern of Russian imperial behavior. And that's what I'm going to look at, how Britain engages with that imperial behavior in the 19th century, a century that saw the United States fight its own great war. With itself, as it happens. But 10 years before that, the British were fighting the Russians. And the story of how they did that and how they went back at the end of the First World War to adjust the borders to improve their security architecture is what I want to look at. So it's a very long story. It takes us up into the Arctic Ocean. It takes us round into the far Pacific. The two main theaters are the Baltic and the Black Sea. The Black Sea is secondary, the Baltic is primary, and all of these regions are regions where the Russians can be contained. The choke points at the Dardanelles, Bosphorus, at the Danish Narrows, and the ice sheets of the Northern Ocean contain Russian maritime activity. And at Petropavlovsk and Vladivostok, they are also hemmed in by geographical features. So Russia is not a natural open ocean navy. They have to fight for it. They have to work quite hard. And that makes it easier to stop them moving. And Russia's main vulnerability is not military, it's economic. Russia is defeated economically in a succession of conflicts in which the British do not land any troops on any Russian territory. They break the Russian economy through economic pressure applied at sea using legal methods, which many in America think caused the War of 1812, stopping neutral carriers carrying the cargo of belligerent parties. The British fought for those rights because they are the key to defeating powers like Russia. If you get your legal system in place, you can then apply it with rigor. If your legal system doesn't work, you have to fight all the harder. The Crimean War of 1854-56 may not be a major item in American culture, but it presages the Civil War, introduces many of the technologies of that war, and has a huge sartorial impact on the Union Army. If you've ever wondered why Union soldiers wore little French hats and had waxed goatee beards and moustaches, it's the Crimean War you have to thank for that. So here's the Black Sea. You are all familiar with the Black Sea, I'm sure. There is Sevastopol. Here's a border between Russia and Moldavia and Wallachia, most modern Romania on the Danube. The Russians seized those provinces from the Ottoman Empire, and the British understand that this means the Russians will move down to Istanbul, close off the Black Sea, and take over control of the Ottoman economy. The British do a lot of trade with the Ottomans, and they're very good customers. This is about money, and the British need that money, and the Russians will close down any country the Russians take over. They close economic access. So you have to fight for economic access. The British demand that the Russians return the provinces. The Russians refuse. And in early December 1853, they sink a Turkish fleet on the south coast of the Black Sea, which is taking supplies to a Turkish army. The British then demand the Russians return to harbor on pain of battle. The British have a fleet now in the Black Sea. And they issue an ultimatum: get out of the provinces by the end of March or else. And the or else is war, and Britain is allied with France. So it's going to have military support from another major power. Here is Sevastopol before the Crimean War. We can see the Russian fleet and the great forts that defend the city. This is the instrument that allows Russia to dominate the Ottomans. A fleet from Sevastopol can be outside Istanbul twice as quick as a fleet from Istanbul can be outside Sevastopol because of the tides and currents. The water flows out of the Black Sea. The real battlefield, however, is going to be the Baltic. St. Petersburg at one end, the Danish Narrows at the other end, mark out the territory. But I'd invite you to look here at the Åland Islands between what is now modern Finland and Sweden, which is used by the Russians as a base to control Stockholm, the Swedish capital. Finland is a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, and the Russians have three major naval bases: Sveaborg outside Helsinki, Reval or Tallinn in what is now Estonia, and Kronstadt right here outside St. Petersburg. It has a large and powerful battle fleet, but this battle fleet is obsolescent. It's sailing ships. The British and the French already have steam-powered battleships. That's the theater. The British have to get in first, and they get in on the day war is declared. And the whole point of declaring war at the end of March is that's when the Baltic ice breaks up and you can start to operate. The Russians won't be able to get out before then, so you've got them trapped inside the Baltic. The admiral sent to command, Sir Charles Napier, is an interesting figure. He's a progressive liberal. He's a member of parliament. He's exactly the kind of politician that the Russians fear, populist democracy. He also has a role in American history. You're all familiar with the line, "The rocket's red glare." Charlie Napier fired them at Baltimore. He was an expert in inshore and littoral combat. His flagship, HMS Duke of Wellington, named for the newly deceased Duke of Wellington, Victor of Waterloo, is the largest steam-powered battleship in the world. It has 130 cannon. It's far too big to operate comfortably in the Baltic, but this immense firepower with the talismanic nature of the name it carries means it has enormous weight. The Royal Navy has a talismanic quality about it because it's so successful over so many centuries that to defeat it, you have to defeat its image as well as its reality. So this is the flagship. It's not going to get anywhere near the Russian coast for very obvious reasons, but it symbolizes British power. Here's a contemporary lithograph by Oswald Brierley, one of the great artists who traveled with the fleet. And here are British steam-powered battleships. See the funnel right there. These are old Napoleonic 74-gun ships. They've been converted into coast attack vessels to bombard Russian positions. The British are planning a maritime expeditionary war. They're taking no troops. They're going to put pressure from the sea using ships. They then land in the Åland Islands to locate a major Russian fortress at Bombasund, which controls a narrow entrance to a large bay where the Russians had stationed their fleet to intimidate Sweden. The British and the French capture and destroy this fort, and this means that Sweden is no longer being bossed by the Russians. This is a massive geostrategic shift, a bit like Sweden joining NATO last year. Yeah? The parallels are very significant. Before then, Sweden was under Russian guidance in the 19th century. And here is Admiral Napier in his straw hat, watching early examples of long-range precision fire. The range is over 3,000 yards, and they are hitting very small targets. This is the first generation of accurate long-range fire from the sea. It's a very interesting scene. There are 4 admirals present, and one of them is actually firing the gun. He's a professional gunnery officer, Admiral Henry Chads. The fortress at Bombasund was completely destroyed. It's not been rebuilt until recently when the Ålanders put it back up as a tourist attraction. The Åland Islands were demilitarized at the end of this conflict. Russia could never again build a naval base there. This released the pressure on Sweden. The Ålanders will tell you that they are the most neutral people on earth. They're not really. To take us back to the very familiar Black Sea, we all know our way around the Black Sea because of the current conflict, and we understand the critical importance of the Sea of Azov up here inside the Kerch Straits. It was just as important back then for slightly different reasons. So the Turkish Empire in grey, the Russian Empire in yellow, and the Austrian Empire in pink away to the edge there. In the summer of 1854, the Austrians demand the Russians evacuate Moldavia and Wallachia on pain of war. The Russians evacuate. This means there is no land frontier now in Europe between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. The British and French have sent 50,000 men to Varna on the coast of Bulgaria to defend Istanbul. They don't need those men now because the Austrians have interposed their army between the belligerents. So the British government suggests that those 50,000 men go to Sevastopol and destroy the naval base. This is a quick adjustment to major strategic change. There is fighting down there in the Caucasus on the Russo-Turkish border, but that's of less significance. The invasion of the Crimea, therefore, is a snap decision to exploit an opportunity thrown up by the exigencies of war. But the target is not to invade Russia, it is to capture a naval base and destroy it. No British soldier will be more than 8 hours' march from the sea at any stage in this conflict. And that's how you beat the Russians. Do not go into Russia. On the 17th of October, very shortly after the Allies arrived, a joint land from this side and sea attack was launched to batter their way into Sevastopol, capture the city, and destroy the naval base. It failed. The French artillery that was sent to bombard the city was inadequate, and the Allies were unable to break in. The fleet was mainly used as a demonstration. There were then a series of battles around the area of Sevastopol. The British are using Balaclava as their base. The French are using Camiche. You're familiar with the term a balaclava, a woolen helmet to keep your head warm in the trenches? There's a lot of Crimean references in British sartorial issues. The British will, with the French, ultimately capture Sevastopol. It takes a little longer than it should have done, but they are successful. Here is the contemporary drawing of Sevastopol, and the real target of these operations is right here It's a collection of major dry docks and naval construction and maintenance facilities. This is the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. If you take the base out, the fleet will wither. The red and green and blue lines are defense lines and attack lines. The British win the campaign with a bit of French assistance by taking control of the Sea of Azov. They capture Kerch and open up the Kerch Straits. They descend gunboats into the Sea of Azov, and they cut off Russia's logistics, which come down the River Don from a place we now know as Stalingrad. The Russians are feeding and arming the Crimean army from a distance using water transport. The British and French cut that, and the Russians are forced to evacuate Sevastopol. They stand one last grand attack, but they are defeated. They're defeated very easily by this, much more easily than they would by conventional warfare. The Royal Navy sends gunboats into the sea, and here we see them inventing a coastal attack platform. It's water casks lashed together with a gun deck on top, and they've got a 32-pounder there. And they're burning all of the fodder for Russia's Crimean army. There's no train in the Crimea. Everything is carried on horse-drawn wagons. If you burn the fodder, the horses can't pull. So again, really simple application of maritime strategy in a critical theater. This takes about 2 months, and it destroys Russia's army. The cavalry have to be sent away, and the logistic supplies no longer come through. The Russians decide, for honor's sake, they will stand one last assault. And on the 9th of September, 1855, the French capture the Malakoff Bastion, and this is the French picture of the battle. And you can see those American Civil War uniforms in their original utility. We know this. All armies in the world like to dress up as the best army. Yeah, you wear the clothes of the people you think are the most effective. Teenagers wear the clothes of their style icons. We all do this one way or another. So here are the French waving the tricolour. This is the end of the French war. They've won La Gloire. They haven't won any territory or any other things, but they've made the Second French Empire look glorious, and they're going to go home and leave the British to it. Here's the Russian side. This is the grand diorama, which is still in Sevastopol, of the Russians taking massive casualties under sustained heavy bombardment because the Allies, supplied by sea over 3,000 miles, can outsupply the Russians in their own country. The logistics of this assault are truly fascinating. The Russians then evacuate the naval base and the city on the south of the harbor, retreat to the northern side, and sink their fleet. It's a fairly catastrophic moment in Russian history. There is then an attack on a Russian battery in a place which is now in the Ukraine, Ochakov Point, which opens up an attack possibly on the Russian shipbuilding place at the place we now know as Mykolaiv. You all heard of that? It's where the Russians used to build their aircraft carriers. That was where the Russians built their battleships. It was ready to be attacked, but the war ended before the attack happens. That was the first use of armored warships in battle. There's fighting in the Caucasus, needn't detain us, and we can drift back to the Baltic. There was a campaign in the White Sea. The Royal Navy sent warships into the White Sea to blockade Archangel. It destroyed the town of Kola on the Kola River, leading to the formation of Murmansk after the war. This is a major trade export zone for the Russians. Grain and particularly timber are coming out of here in very large volumes, which the British are stopping. The British end up fighting a gun battle with the Russian monastery in the White Sea. Russian monks are not like ordinary monks. They have guns, and their monasteries are fortresses. So it was a score draw. The British didn't capture the monastery, and the Russians didn't sink the British ships. Everybody in the London newspapers thought it was very funny, but it wasn't. It was quite serious. There was also a battle in Petropavlovsk in the far east of Russia. Again, it's a narrow little bay. The Russians are hiding. An Anglo-French force attacks and is beaten off. So the Russians are under real economic pressure. Their economic numbers collapse, and they don't have any access to capital. The London capital market means that the Russians cannot get into British money, and the British use their economic leverage to stop them gaining resources anywhere else. In desperation to defend themselves, the Russians start using the first underwater mines. 2 British survey vessels hit the mines, but they're not big enough to sink ships. That afternoon, the Royal Navy conducted the world's first mine countermeasures sweep and pulled up about 200 mines. They set a few off to see how they worked, and they didn't cause them too much trouble after that. It's kind of World War II story, magnetic mines. Same. The people who develop mines are the ones who are most frightened of people using the sea to attack them. It's a modern view of St. Petersburg and Kronstadt. These causeways were not in place in the 19th century. If you're going from the west towards St. Petersburg, you go south of Kronstadt into St. Petersburg, and that is where all of the great forts of Kronstadt are located. So it is the biggest maritime fortress complex in the world because the Russians are really frightened of the Royal Navy. Here's a drawing done by a British naval officer. In those days, you didn't use a camera because you didn't have one. You painted and drew. So all British naval officers were trained to a fairly high standard to produce this as action reportage. We've got a British frigate here, and here we see all these huge Russian fortresses, and the smoke coming out of them is because they're stoking up red-hot shot to fire at wooden ships. So the Russians are ready for a battle. The Russian fleet is deployed so that it can defend the gaps between the fortresses. The Russians have now pulled all of their navy back out of the Gulf of Finland, out of the Baltic, right back to base, and it's entirely defensively deployed. The Russians have no capacity now to counterattack. They've been pushed to the very edge of the Baltic Sea. This is a different fortress. This is Sveaborg, or Suomenlinna, the Swedish castle on the outskirts of Helsinki, capital of Finland. This is the navigable channel into the fort, into Helsinki, open sea, Helsinki back up there. This is also the base of the Russian gunboat fleet, and it's their dockyard and major facility. The British identified this as a target for coastal attack, and at the beginning of August 1855, they started a 3-day, 24-hour-a-day bombardment using mortars, cannon, and rockets. This operation was completely forgotten by everybody outside of the Russians because not a single British or French sailor was killed. This is an almost bloodless battle on the Allied side. It's very different for the Russians. In the middle of the battle, the main Russian magazine is hit, and there's a tremendous explosion. The Finns every year have their annual firework competition on the anniversary of this event. And the best firework display gets to do the Christmas fireworks. The artist who painted this was in the fleet, British artist, and here we see the magazine again exploding and the British sailors cheering. The Finns ashore thought the British were going to land, so they all left town pretty quickly. This is the most impressive demonstration of coastal offensive firepower in the war, but it's only a scintilla of what the British were preparing to do in the following season. So the dockyard is destroyed, the gunboats are burnt, the Russian fleet at Sveaborg is also disabled. This means the British can push all of their naval force right up the Gulf of Finland to stand off St. Petersburg. And they're developing plans to knock down Kronstadt and capture St. Petersburg in the spring of 1856. These plans are overtaken when the Russians surrender because they are bankrupt. The Russian government is no longer receiving any returns on its exports. Russian landowners are not getting paid for their crops. There are now bread riots, there are draft riots, and the stability of Russia is being threatened. So nobody has been in the center of Russia with hostile intent, but Russia is broken and defeated, and they are obliged to sign a very prejudicial peace treaty in order to end the fighting. Back in the Crimea, the British have decided that they have work to do, and the Army's Royal Engineers, who are the intellectual elite of the British Army, are going to spend 6 months blowing up the dockyard. They're going to blow every last bit of it to pieces as a statement and as a denial of capability. So here are the dry docks, and here are the British Royal Engineers in the bottom of the dock. You can just see them down here. They're drilling down under the dock and packing gunpowder in there. They're going to rupture the whole structure and destroy all of its parts. You need to know, however, that the French are very busily watching what the British are doing, because the British fully intended to do the same to French dockyards. And if they were provoked, they would have done the same to American dockyards as well. And of course, the Trent crisis very nearly brought that to happen. So here are the French wondering why on earth the British are spending all this time blowing up some dry docks. And the answer is, if you want to rule the sea, you stop other people having navies. On St. George's Day, 1856, that's the national day of the English nation, the 23rd of April, 1856, outside Portsmouth, which is right in the middle of the picture, the fleet that was prepared to attack St. Petersburg is paraded before the Queen Victoria. And we see the royal yacht here proceeding. We see the ships firing salutes. But all of these vessels are gunboats. There are 200 gunboats. This is your inshore attack facility. This is how you project power from the sea in 1856. The entire diplomatic corps from London are wheeled down to Portsmouth to see this. They are made to understand that Britain has the power to destroy their coastal positions, to wreck their navies, and to destroy their economies. This is deterrence, 1856 style. It's not nuclear, but it's very frightening. The French understand that they have a dockyard 60 miles from here, and that's the obvious first target, but there are plenty more. When it's over, the British don't leave the gunboats lying around. They pick them out of the water and stow them away in a gigantic car park on a railway system. And they're ready to be mobilized and put back in the sea at pretty short order. And the Americans will give them the cause to do that within a few years. 1861-62, Trent crisis. Union warship stops British mail steamer in international waters, clear violation of international law. The British demand restitution. The Union government briefly says, we're not going to do that. And then Charles Francis Adams, the ambassador in London, reads in the Times, the newspaper, that the dockyard at Portsmouth is working double time to mobilize the gunboat fleet. He immediately writes to the president and advises him to back down as gracefully as possible, which is exactly what he did, a very statesmanlike thing to do. Anglo-Russian relations didn't improve in the 19th century. The Russians were constantly pushing into Turkey. The British mobilized fleets and sent them. In fact, they didn't send fleets into the Baltic. They just said they were going to, and that was enough. The Russians were deterred by the threat of a fleet in the Baltic. That tells you how effective they must have been in the 1850s. In 1885, the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and the British did exactly the same. Same ships, same people, and the Russians backed down again. By 1914, the Russians have so fortified the Gulf of Finland that they call it Peter the Great's naval fortress. Minefield belts, huge gun batteries, and a fleet of ships entirely designed for defensive coastal warfare. They are not building a battle fleet to fight the British. They're building ships to deploy artillery as mobile batteries to support the defense of their territory. They have reconfigured what navies need to look like to serve a particular purpose. And if you look at the modern Russian Navy, it's not like our Navy or your Navy. It's a very Russian strategic model. And the better you understand that, the less likely you are to mistake it for something that is not intended to be. The Russians are not coming out to sea to play one-on-one battles. That's not how they view the world. One rather suspects other large authoritarian countries don't do that either. When the First World War ended, everybody was very tired. The British had been in it from the start, so they were completely worn out. But the Russian Revolution had created a problem and an opportunity. Russia was now weak, it was divided, it had a civil war, it was tearing itself to pieces. And the British could see that many of the countries that had been in the Russian Empire would want to break out. Everybody else says, well, just leave it. And the British don't. They send a small force, 4 light cruisers. It's one of them, HMS Cassandra. These vessels are of 4,000 tons. They have 5-6-inch guns. They're not battleships. They're very small in modern terms. They'd be a corvette today. They send 10,000-ton destroyers, again, 1,000 tons, and a couple of submarines, a few support ships, minimal. And they send it under a very aggressive young rear admiral who's made his name in the war already, and they don't give him particularly restrictive orders about rules of engagement and what exactly he's meant to do. They rely on the initiative of the man on the spot because he's a trusted and ambitious young fellow. This is Walter Cowan. The picture, I think, gives it all away. He knows what he's doing, and he doesn't need you to tell him. You know? He's going to make some tough decisions which take Britain to the verge of war with the Soviet Union. We are never at war with the Soviet Union, but we are fighting them. It's a really interesting exercise, again, in legality. This is an interesting point to remember. So, St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg again, and Kronstadt, this is Russia's main vulnerability. This is the home of half of Russia's war industries. All of their shipyards, most of their mechanical and heavy engineering and electrical engineering is in St. Petersburg. If they lose that, it's a total wipeout for all their modern weapon systems. This is the current border of Finland and Russia, going past Imatra. But this is the border of Finland proper, which was in place in 1919 when Finland breaks out of the Russian Empire. It's less than 100 miles from the Finnish border to St. Petersburg. That's not comfortable. Stalin will recover this block of territory in 1940 in the Winter War. It's doubly important because the main base for an attack on Kronstadt and St. Petersburg is Bjorko Sound. That's where you put all of your support ships. That's where you operate out of. And the Russians know all of this. So the interwar period, they're under great threat. They have even less of a coast on the Baltic than they have today. So what are the Bolsheviks trying to do? They're trying to win a civil war. They're trying to get control of the levers of power in Russia. And in order to do that, they're going to have to make some compromises. They don't have enough troops to win in the north, the center, and the south. They're going to have to give up something. They can't keep it all. Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin are very concerned about a white Russian army advancing from the south through the Ukraine, through Kyiv, which looks like it's going to get to Moscow and overthrow their regime. So they want to close down the fighting in the Baltic area in order to release their armies to fight in the center of Russia. The heartland of Russia is not the Baltic coast, it's right in the middle. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are effectively now independent. They were part of Russia, they're now on their own, and they're fighting the Russians for their independence. The British support them, using naval power to keep Russian naval power out of the battles, to provide gunfire support when the Estonians in particular are advancing. So what Walter Cowan and his men are doing is providing just enough support to really help those Baltic states get free without doing enough to force the Bolsheviks to declare war. So they're dancing on the head of a pin here, but they're getting away with it. So here we've got the current situation, Russian border, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kaliningrad, the oblast which the Russians kept in 1945, Königsberg in old money, which is Russia's window on the West these days. Of course, in the Cold War, all of this was part of the Warsaw Pact, and therefore it didn't matter whether Kaliningrad was Russian or not. Now it does. So today, with NATO acceding Finland and Sweden into its membership, the Baltic is a NATO lake. NATO is not sufficiently present in the Baltic to make that pressure really felt. But this means Russia cannot export anything out of the Baltic without NATO powers concurrence. You have to go through the territorial waters of NATO powers to get out of the Baltic. Sweden and Denmark are in a position to stop any traffic going out of the Baltic. And this is a large part of Russia's export industry, and they're selling lots of material abroad to raise funds for the current war. So squeeze the economic line, use the law to justify that. The British government ramped up sanctions against Russian tankers only last week. We need to keep in step on this across the NATO alliance to keep that pressure rising until Russia is forced to concede. The Russians still had a few ships in the Baltic, and they were prepared to use them. This is the Petropavlovsk, which was being used to bombard Estonian troops. So the British decided they needed to do something about Russian ships attacking the Estonians. So in August 1919, they used their air and motor torpedo boat forces to attack Kronstadt. So this is a pretty spectacular raid, which sank a battleship and several other vessels. This is the aerial recce photo, one of the first good examples of using aerial reconnaissance. You can see the main dockyard complex on this side of the picture, and then the fortified outer barriers on the other. In the middle of the night, the torpedo boats get into the harbor, the bombs are dropped. The Russians lose one of their two operational battleships. The British think they've sunk both of them, but it's actually only one. But this really knocks the morale of the Russian Navy. It makes the Russians very nervous about going to sea. And within 24 hours, Lenin, who's now in charge of Bolshevik Russia, has offered independence to all of the Baltic states. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all given an option to sign up to be no longer part of Russia, because they're under such pressure in the south and the north that they have to compromise. Lenin fears they will lose St. Petersburg, and if they lose that, they will lose the war. So he takes a calculated gamble, like all statesmen do. He decides to sacrifice these valuable assets for the future in order to preserve the regime. Stalin will get it all back in 1940. And he gets it back to stop the Royal Navy coming up the Baltic and doing to the Soviet Union what it had done in 1919. He had a long memory. He rebuilt the defense of the Gulf of Finland. His winter war against Finland is about recovering the gun batteries at the northern entrance to the Gulf of Finland. That's his first stipulation, the batteries at Hango Head. Here's a contemporary view of Kronstadt. This one is Fort Alexander. It's one of the biggest forts, but they're spread out and they remain exactly as they were with St. Petersburg in the background. Towards the end of the campaign, things were stabilizing. The Estonians started talking to the Russians about peace. They did this in Tartu, or Dorpat, where all the treaties that liberated the Baltic states were signed off. The main barrier to a quick signing off was the Russo-Polish War. Poland also was fighting for its independence, but the Poles were getting assistance not from the British, but from the French. That was the longest and most bloody of those wars of independence, which the Poles ultimately win. But towards the end of the season, the British decide they need a little more firepower in the Baltic. So they send the 15-inch gun-armed monitor HMS Erebus into the Baltic, and it goes right up the Gulf of Finland to within gun range of Kronstadt. And then it fires 200 rounds into a big Russian fort at a place called Krasnaya Gorka, which is the key to the whole defense of the Gulf of Finland. They don't intend to capture the fort. They don't intend to support an Estonian advance on the fort. They just want to demonstrate that they have enormous firepower and they are very much prepared to use it. So it's a day-night shoot, 200 rounds of 2-ton shells. The Russians read the lesson in exactly the right way, and they don't resist. 2 weeks later, the same ship fires 200 rounds of shrapnel into a renegade German army in Riga, and that's the end of the Germans trying to control Latvia. By the end of the season, the Baltic is essentially a British lake, and all of these new countries are looking to Britain as the leader of the free world. None of the other Allied victorious powers in 1919 did anything in this theatre. They all stood aside and let the British do it, which was probably wise. In 1920, the British decided to make a point. And I apologize for this photograph. It doesn't literally have the bow of the ship in it at any stage. It's not an inaccurate version of it. This is the world's biggest and most beautiful battleship. In fact, it's a battle cruiser, HMS Hood, Copenhagen, May 1920. This ship is fresh out of the builder's yard. It's just run its acceptance trials at 44,000 tons. It's the biggest capital ship in the world. And its first ever deployment is into the Baltic to make a point. And the admiral commanding, Sir Roger Keyes, is the hero of the assault on Zeebrugge, a desperate attack on a naval base. You're getting the drift of my inference, yeah. Keyes is the man you want to talk to because he is very impressive. You know, he even impressed Ernie King, so he must have been quite good. This ship is British power encapsulated. This says more about Britain than any other thing. It's accompanied by another very big battle cruiser, HMS Tiger, and the two of them go on a grand tour around the Baltic to boost the morale of these new states, just to make them feel a bit better. You've all done this if you've been at sea with the Navy. You've been somewhere to try and make them feel better about who they are. That's a pretty nice way of doing it. This will be the emblem of Britishness for the next 21 years before it goes bang in the Denmark Strait in a battle with the Bismarck. That's the day the British Empire died. Yeah, 21st of May, 1941. Here is Hood running her trials, 32 knots. Not bad, not bad. So ultimate sea power symbol, deployed into a theatre where you would never use a ship like this. You'd have to be insane to deploy a ship like this in the Baltic. The Baltic is narrow, it's rocky, it's got thin, low salinity water, so you sink even deeper in there. It's a nightmare. It's a small ship theatre. But you can make a point. And then after that, what the British did was every few years they would send some destroyers and cruisers around the Baltic. A fleet just like the one that Walter Cowan led went around the Baltic and visited all of the places that were most concerned that the Russians didn't come back. The British ruled the Baltic all the way through the interwar years. It's not until the late 30s when the Germans become a problem that they don't. And this gives those independent democratic states in the region the opportunity to get their game together and become modern states, part of the modern Western world. All of that is crushed in 1940, but it resumes again in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapses. So they went round, and this repetition is important. You have to keep going back. You can't just do it once. You have to keep the effect up. Kaliningrad has remained an issue, and people are quite worried about the missiles in Kaliningrad. But the Swedes have been looking at this, and they're fairly sure that they can deal with this problem. So Kaliningrad is not anywhere near as much of a threat to ships in the Baltic as people have been arguing. It's also cut off, rather like Sevastopol in the 1850s. It's been cut off. There is no overland route to resupply, and the Russians, funnily enough, don't have any ships that can carry the kit they need to take to Kaliningrad, so it's literally withering as we speak. It would be a nice end if we could clear that up and remove it, because it doesn't belong there. It's not Russian. It has no Russian history before 1945. So Russia has always been vulnerable to economic pressure. And economic pressure and maritime pressure reinforce each other. They are a serious alternative. In denying Russia access to export markets in 1700, in 1800, in 1900, and today is absolutely critical, because the Russians today are selling oil, grain, and other materials at below cost price to fund their war. And the sooner they stop doing that, the sooner their money runs out and they stop fighting. Because even Russia can't fight without money. And if you think about other places, when the money starts to run out, they won't fight either. So go for the points that really work. Land-based invasions of Russia have consistently failed for the fairly obvious reasons. It's enormous, the infrastructure is low, and the Russians seem to be quite enthusiastic about defending their country. They have been told that we're out to get them. If you listen to Putin, he's talking about a mentality in which the world has something against Russia. Would that be because they behave so badly? If you invade other people's country, other people don't like you? Russia has a very long track record, and its sense of itself is at odds with that of most of the civilized world. Land-based invasions fail because Russia has endless resources. When Napoleon invades, the thing that defeats him ultimately is Russian horsepower. The Russians have generated an enormous reserve of cavalry horses. So when the French are eating their horses, the Russians are still mounted and they're defeating the French. Why are the Russians fighting Napoleon? Because the alternative is bankruptcy. So the key tools for engaging Russia are not warships, they're not armies or air forces, they are legal and they are effective sanctions measures. Those are the tools that will bring Russia to see reason. Defeating Russia is a very big question. Making Russia understand that it cannot do what it wants to do, that's a different level. And we need to think very carefully about those two things. A fight to the finish with Russia would be suicidal on both counts, but persuading Russia through economic pressure to relinquish its activities would, I think, be a possibility. It's worth exploring. And thinking about how we address other major threats in other theaters, the economic tool is very important. And we have to remember that if you control the sea, and the Western Alliance, NATO, and its fellow travelers do control the sea, we are at liberty to choose how to use that control and where to employ it. If Russia is sending oil, let us say, to India, which it is, we don't have to go anywhere near Russia to stop that oil moving. We can pick it up off the coast of South Africa or in the Suez Canal. We can use legal measures to stop it, not military measures. The Russians won't allow anybody on board their tankers when they leave the Baltic through the Danish Narrows because they are unsafe and would be impounded. The problem is that if a Russian tanker runs aground in the Baltic Narrows and 200,000 tons of crude oil flow into the Baltic, it will kill the whole sea. So the stakes are high. So if the Russians are playing that game, don't shoot at them because we don't want the oil all over the place. For all of what I've said, you may be surprised to learn that the British memory of the Crimean War has absolutely no naval content. As far as the British are concerned, the Crimean War is about one heroic cavalry charge. You've all heard of the Charge of the Light Brigade, which was far more successful than the poet makes out. It's about Florence Nightingale, who introduced modern business management process into hospitals. She was not a nurse. She was a hospital manager and did quite a good job. And it's about the heroism of the men standing on the British War Memorial. They're members of the Grenadier Guards. We can tell by their headdress. And military victories at great expense, but victories that proved to be futile. Within 14 years, the French Second Empire had been overcome and destroyed by Prussia, and Louis Napoleon was in exile, and those facial hairstylings went completely out of fashion with Louis Napoleon. So the British memory is of a war that was unsuccessful, but we destroyed Russia's navy, we threatened Russia's capital, and we destroyed their main naval base in the Black Sea, which was the engine that was going to bring them victory in their campaign against the Ottoman Empire. So history is not what happened, it's how we remember it. And we don't remember a lot of things very accurately. We're quite happy with the school textbook version, and we tend to think that that is what happened. History is a debate without end because we are endlessly changing where we stand. And we view history from today, not from the past. So old history is out of date because we have moved. And we need to adjust our mental planning to think that history is not the past. It is how we access the past as a source of guidance. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it probably tells you what not to do, i.e. don't invade Russia. It helps you to shape your ideas going forward. It's the basis of sound doctrine, both political and military. And these are things that Alfred Thayer Mahan was saying around here 100-odd years ago. And at the same time in Britain, Sir Julian Corbett is saying very similar things. These two men are having a dialogue in which they're bringing on their navies to understand the strategy comes from experience. And if you haven't got that experience yourself, you have to find it somewhere. And the somewhere is back in the past. The quality of your history will shape the quality of your doctrine, your strategy, your operations, and everything else. So great history makes for great practical utility. The men who won the Pacific War, they studied the past, and they thought about it very seriously, and they war-gamed it, they worked it through, and they made mostly the right calls because they were informed by that valuable experience. So history is a key part of professional military education, and it always will be. And I'd like to finish by thanking everyone involved again. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that this will conclude our presentation and award ceremony this evening. Please, one more round of applause for Professor Lambert.
Thank you.